The most important thing you can do, in my opinion, when it comes to being on the same page with your kids is to appear as a united front as much as possible, right? So in our household we use the phrase like all the grown-ups have the same rules a lot. So whenever there's pushback, that's one of the things we say, like, well, if dad says that, I say the same thing. All the grown-ups have the same rules.
Welcome to The Way of the Muse, a podcast for women who want to create richness in every area of their lives, from business and career to lifestyle, relationships, family, purpose, and fulfillment. I'm Gigi Sage.
And I'm Makena Sage. We're a mother-daughter coaching team, and combined, we've spent over 4 decades helping people create their best and most fully expressed lives. If you're ready to step into your bigger dreams with ease, fun, and flow, you're in the right place. Let's get into the episode.
Hello, everyone.
Hello, everyone, and hello, Mariah. I'm Makena.
So we are back. We had an episode recently with Mariah Sage, my sister, who is a brilliant family systems coach and parenting coach, and we got a lot of great feedback from that. So we decided to do another one on another common topic that we, get questions about from our clients or hear about, and Mariah said the same. So today we're going to talk about getting on the same page about your parenting style or your parenting approach. So what do you do in terms of, you're 2 different people raising your kids? How do you sort of make sure that you're aligned in the way that you're parenting? Because that can sometimes feel a little disjointed for people. So Mariah, I'd love to just know from you to begin. Well, first of all, if this is people's first time, hearing you, because some people it might be their first episode or they didn't hear the last one, you want to just tell them, is there anything else you'd like to share about yourself first before we dive in?
So I work with families on kind of creating more peace and harmony in their lives with their kids. So improving family dynamics, setting up systems that kind of make life a little easier, and kind of figuring out your discipline style, your parenting style, getting on the same page with your partner, other caregivers, and dealing with all the breakdowns in the day-to-day life with your kiddos. So I'm excited to
Someone
talk about
that's
this
about
topic.
to have my first child. I am very happy to have you on speed dial. It's going to be great. And people can follow you on Instagram, right? At Easeful Mama. So
Yes.
At Easeful Mama on Instagram, MAMA. Amazing. So tell us a little bit about this challenge in terms of what we're talking about today. What do you see people struggling with here when you work with parents?
Yeah. Well, I think it's such a common breakdown for families, like you said, because you're 2 individuals, and then all of a sudden you come together, and even if you've been together for years and you've figured out how to run many aspects of your life together, all of a sudden when you're raising little humans, not only do you have to find an approach that you can both follow to discipline and to set boundaries and to kind of get your kids to do the things you want and need them to do, but you bring all of your own programming in with the way that you parent, right? When you have little kids, you find yourself reacting and responding in the way that you were raised most of the time. And so inevitably you weren't raised in the same way as your partner. And so there's going to be discrepancies. And so what happens there is that, well, it can just be really confusing and frustrating for your kids because they get a different response or a different approach from both parents. So it feels like the rules aren't always the same and they don't know what to expect. So that causes more pushback, more breakdowns. But also as kids get older, they get smart and they start learning how to use that to their advantage and knowing which parent to go to for which issue and, knowing who they can get what from and things like that. And then the other thing is over time, it causes really kind of toxic family dynamics, right? Because small breakdowns or small disagreements can turn into resentment with your partner when you don't agree, or when it feels like one parent is always the one that has to be the disciplinarian or always has to hold the line on things, and the other parent kind of tends to give in more easily or doesn't feel as strongly about certain boundaries. And so that can cause a lot of breakdowns. And then over time, those breakdowns, as your kids grow and their personalities develop, it gets more complex, and those kind of dynamics can go all through the family, and you lose that feeling of the unity of the parents being a team and really being able to work together to raise their kids.
Yeah, and I would say that I would mark this as one of the big ones, like sex and money in a relationship. I think this is the third one of a really can derail a relationship. I've seen it many, many, many times. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
I think that's fascinating to think about because people talk about sex and money a lot of the times as those big
Mm.
hot topic or hot trigger items. But for parents, it makes sense that this is a big one. And I think what you touched on, Mariah, in terms of like one parent becoming the disciplinarian, that's one I've heard a lot. The other one I've heard is like one parent is the primary person that's with the kids. And so sort of automatically they become maybe the disciplinarian, but also just like the structure, or they're the one setting the tone. And then when the other parent comes in and um, they are present with the kids, it can feel frustrating for the other. It feels
Mm-hmm.
frustrating for both. I think the one that's there all the time, who's like, wait, now we're taking a different approach and this isn't working. And then the one who's not usually as present, they're working or they're busy. And then they're like, well, I don't want to just do your approach, right? I want to have a say in how we raise our kids. Yeah. So that's something we definitely see. Anything else about that before we kind of talk about what people can do about it?
I would say I think that there's been a big cultural shift over, I don't know, the last several decades where, I think a lot of people, maybe like a generation up from me, can relate to being raised in a way where, their moms just used the like, wait till your dad gets home threat. And it was sort of like, the mom was the one who managed a lot of the day to day in most families, but then the dad was kind of like this bottom line discipline person. But today there's such a shift in the way that we're parenting and dynamics with parents. And so in a lot of families, actually, the moms have become the main boundary setters. And then, if the dad is working and isn't there as much, then he comes home and he wants to be the fun parent, and it could be vice versa, right? But it's like whatever parent is with the children most often, a lot of that weight falls on them being the primary parent to be the one who kind of sets up the rules and boundaries. And then they can feel like they're kind of getting undermined when the other parent comes in and has been gone all day and then wants to come home and just enjoy their kids, which is fair. And so that's where, a lot of people just don't ever have these conscious conversations about, okay, well, what approach are we taking so that we can make sure we're being consistent? And then, by the way, it gets even more complex when you have other caregivers in your life. If you have nannies or grandparents or other people coming in, it really just helps to have, clarity around what approach you're taking. So, and most people just don't even think to talk about that, I think.
Yeah, and I'm going to throw something in here too. I think it's so important if you can. This is same for divorced parents, right? Because it's the same thing because you're raising your kids, and if you have a conscious conversation, if both people will share with each other and then you come to an aligned way you want to raise the kids, that makes it so much easier on the kids and everybody else too. Yeah. Yeah.
That's a great point.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I hear from parents that they're like, well, we try to talk about this, but it just doesn't go anywhere. It's like we kind of have these conversations and dialogue about it a little bit, but then it's like we don't come to really a solution. So I'm curious, Mariah, how would you advise or coach someone to start to have these conversations, but really get them to a place where they can get some clarity or make some choices about how they want to, whether that's just raise their kids, discipline their kids, just like what's the approach? How do they get on the same page?
Yeah, I think anytime you're talking about discipline and boundary settings with kids, there's basically two tracks, right? There's the things that happen consistently and are those kind of recurring breakdowns, and then there's like the in the moment things where you're just having to make a decision on the fly, right? So When it comes to the recurring things, the very first thing would be to sit down with your partner and just make a list of what are the common breakdowns that are happening in your family, and especially anywhere maybe one of you doesn't feel confident in how to respond, or you have a disagreement around how to respond, because that's also a big thing that I see, is that in a lot of families, I've talked to many moms who feel like their husbands don't do as much kind of boundary setting or holding the rules as they do. And when you get down to it, what it turns out is that the parent who's not doing that as much just doesn't have the skills, right? Like they just actually don't feel confident in how to respond. And so then in the moment when they're frustrated with their kids, they're just kind of grasping at whatever they can come up with in the moment, to make things move along or make things work. And so just even figuring out, is this actually something we disagree on, or is this something where one parent just needs some skills and some help knowing how to respond? Because then it also takes the blame out of it, I think, because a lot of the time these conversations can turn into like, well, you approach this wrong, or the way you do it doesn't work, when actually it's like, well, hey, do you need help figuring out how to respond here? So the very first step would be kind of making that list, like what are the top 5 breakdowns that happen in our family? What are those areas where our kids are pushing back all the time? And that's a clue. Like you might not even realize that it's an issue of you disagreeing or not being on the same page. But if your kids are really pushing back in one area, I can almost guarantee you it's because you're not being consistent across, even you yourself are not being consistent, or you and your other caregivers are not being consistent.
I am curious. So if you make this list, you sit down with your partner, so you guys kind of set some time aside to have this conversation. Maybe you make the list together, or you each bring your own list. What do you do in each situation? So if you really do disagree, then you just have to talk it out and kind of come to an agreement in this arena. And then the other question, part 2, would be like, what if it's not that you disagree, right? So it's just that you need to, just how do you approach each one?
Yeah, so there's a few different things. One approach that I've seen a lot of families take and that I sometimes recommend is sort of deciding on different areas where each parent kind of owns that area. So, there was a family that I worked with years ago where one of the parents was a doctor, and they were like, hey, well, since I'm a doctor, if there's anything that comes up in our kids' lives that's medical, then that's kind of my call, right? So that's an area where I'm going to have the final say. I'm going to make the decisions. Whereas the other parent kind of had stronger feelings and background in education and academics. And so their agreement was, okay, these are 2 areas where when it comes to academics, it's not that we can't discuss it together and I can't give you my input, but at the end of the day, I make decisions around that, right? Mm-hmm. So that's one way is, what are some areas that you own versus I own? And then the other parent just has to go along with what that, person says. Or the other thing is that sometimes it's just one parent that's there at that time, right? So if the recurring breakdown is around bedtime, for example, and there's one parent or one caregiver who mostly handles bedtime, then that thing just kind of is their thing to decide on. And so then what that means is that even if there's an off day where, dad usually does bedtime and tonight mom is doing it, she follows the rules that he sets because he's the one who kind of owns that time of day. And what all of this kind of points to is that the most important thing you can do, in my opinion, when it comes to being on the same page with your kids is to appear as a united front as much as possible, right? So in our household, we use the phrase like all the grown-ups have the same rules a lot. So whenever there's pushback, that's one of the things we say, like, well, if dad says that, I say the same thing. All the grown-ups have the same rules, because then it's just, even if sometimes those discrepancies show up and the kids pick up on it, the message that they're getting overall is, no, we all agree. We're all parenting you in the same way. We're all raising you in the same way. And, sometimes, my son's only 3, but he's starting to try to figure this out. So sometimes he'll do it right in front of us. He'll ask me a question and I'll say no, and then he'll go to his dad and ask him the same question because he hasn't quite figured out the logistics of that yet. And
he hasn't figured out that he probably needs to take one of you in the other room.
The other thing is kids become
so smart at this so young.
Yeah.
You watch I even watch Wilder like check out, what you guys say, and you can see they're already making distinctions like, is that the same thing? Or is that the same? Kids are so great. That's not the same thing you said last time, right?
Yeah,
Because all
exactly.
they have to do is think about these little things, right? So their brains remember everything, which is so funny. Yeah. And not so funny sometimes, right? So, and
I
I
love
think
that all the grown-ups have the same rules. I love that.
Yeah, it's really impressive how early they figure this stuff out and just how smart they are, and it's their job to test the rules. That's the thing. I think that sometimes we think kids are being bad or being difficult, but really like that's what they're designed to do. They're supposed to try to figure out, okay, is this true in the morning as well as at night? Is it true on the weekend as well as the weekdays? Is it true with mom as well as dad, right? So that testing is just it's just wired into kids. And so, but what happens when we are consistent and we all get on the same page as their caregivers is that they can actually relax because they don't have to spend so much energy testing and fighting all the time because they just know this is the way it's going to happen. So, yeah, so then you get into the kind of details of what do those responses look like, which is a whole bigger conversation. But ultimately, it's the decision in your relationship that you're going to back your partner up. And sometimes that means in moments when you don't agree with them. So I have moments sometimes with my husband where he sets a boundary and I'm like, in my head, I'm like, why would he say that? But I choose to outwardly be like, your dad said this, because I want my kids to get that we're on the same team.
mm,
That's huge. Yeah, I think that's something that I know people in my life, friends and things like that talk about that when they were growing up, they knew their parents weren't on the same team. They knew that they could sort of play one against the other, or not even that, just that they were going to get something completely different from each parent. And that was really challenging and, kind of disconcerting for them because it was not a united front. So that's something that I think is so important. And it sounds like there's just something to taking the time as a couple to sit down and talk about these things, to make that list, to decide which, when people are busy and they're just going through life, some people haven't thought about that apart from like the in the moment conversation of like, hey, this thing came up and they had different opinions on how it should be handled. And they're trying to address that in the moment. It's like putting that time on the calendar, going to a coffee shop or, making dinner at home or whatever, when you don't have the kids there to really have this conversation.
And I think one thing with that is just like completing the conversation. Because I think I was just talking to a family recently who had this. They were a family who did communicate a lot about their family dynamics and who were kind of consciously thinking about this stuff. But what would happen is that they would talk about these things with each other and then they would never finish the conversation. They would just kind of be like, oh, well, I think that this is important. And the other parent would say, well, I think this is important. And then they would kind of disagree and talk about it. And then they would get sidetracked, as you do when you have kids and busy lives. And so I think an important thing there is to just kind of be like, hey, no, let's finish this conversation. What's the rule going to be here? We're not agreeing on, I think this had something to do with whether or not their kids were allowed to read at the breakfast table, right? And just, let's finish up the conversation. Let's complete the loop here and say, what are we going to agree on, and then move on, because otherwise it's just something that creates frustration, and then it just keeps creating frustration again and again and again, when actually it's probably not that big of a deal a lot of the time, is the truth, right?
But the thing about this, Mariah, and this is what I think is so powerful about what you do, is people don't know how to implement.
Mm-hmm.
They really don't. They have these, like you're saying, these conversations. So like you're saying, these little things or steps that you can take. And if people have that, then it's like, oh, okay, now we know what to do next. Because I find that so much with couples, they can talk and talk and talk, but then they don't know what to do about it afterwards. And so the simple steps like you're talking about start to give them a grid or a guideline they can use, which is huge, huge. Yeah. So
How
what
does
are
that
some
work?
more of those?
Well, I was going to say too, how does that work if you do disagree in front of the kids? Because I feel like that's going to happen sometimes, and you're kind of talking about, okay, maybe you talk it out right there and you come up with something, but like I feel like that that's going to happen. It's kind of like we all wish that we wouldn't, flip out at our kids, but occasionally it's probably going to happen, right? You're going to be like under-resourced. And so if you're not a united front and you do have conflict in front of the kids, like just how can parents navigate that?
There's some distinctions there. I mean, I think conflict in front of your kids is its own thing. So if this is something really important to you, or it's like a charged issue that could lead to conflict in front of your kids, that's sort of a separate thing. Then like most of these things, a lot of the time are little things, it's just that the frustration builds up around them because one parent, for example, like, okay, I'm trying to make sure that my kids eat their vegetables at dinner, and then the other parent comes in and they just say, okay, yeah, fine, you can get up, you don't have to eat your vegetables, and then the frustration that creates, because if you are the parent who's dealing with that topic all the time, then that's like something you've been working really hard on with your kids, right? That's something that you've been putting a lot of effort into, and so with that, I would argue that most of the time it's back them up in front of the kids and then step aside and talk about it. So you could have a code word or a shoulder tap that's like, hey, come in the other room for a second and let's talk this out. Or if you do end up fighting in front of your kids or having conflict, I think the biggest thing there is just always to repair in front of them. That's, I think, the most important thing, because it's normal for kids to see. Also, like, yes, you want to be in a united front to them, but they know you're individuals. They know you're different people. And it's okay for them to see the full spectrum of what a relationship looks like. And conflict is part of a healthy relationship, right? But I think what's hard for kids is when they see the conflict, but then they don't see the conversation that happens later, where then you talk it out and you repair. So I think it's really important to always come back around and let your kids see the full process that happens there.
I love that. There's something we haven't touched on yet, which I know you talk about a lot, which is values as a family and kind of getting aligned on what those values are. Does that play into this conversation at all in terms of getting on the same page with your partner?
Yeah, I mean, I think that values can be a guiding post when it comes to this stuff, right? Like if there's something that you're not sure what the right approach is, you're not sure what the right rule is, or, let's say it's something bigger, like, you're trying to decide if your kids are ready to have sleepovers or something, something like that, where it's like a growing up thing and both parents, can't agree about it, then yeah, I think it's helpful to sit down and look at your values and decide where these things fall in.
Are we just talking about little kids, or we're talking about older kids as well too, right?
I think older kids as well.
Yeah. And so would you have the kids become part of that conversation, or how do you do that?
Certainly. Yeah. I mean, when it comes to just setting up rules and boundaries in general, or what do you mean?
I just mean with the values, like if you are going to do, like I know you do family values a lot of time. Do you make that with the older kids? Because we have clients that have older kids, right?
Yeah.
And so with that, would you involve the kids in it, or does the couple, they really look at their values and then they ask the kids what values? How would you do that?
Most of the time, because really the truth is if your kids are older, you've been raising them with a certain set of values. And so there might be another value that you want to add in, or that is something that's important to your kids. And absolutely, they could be a part of that conversation. But I think when it comes to this stuff, it's really about like, yeah, if your kids are older, you can talk to them about your values. And that's also a helpful framework for example, why they might not be allowed to do something that a friend is allowed to do, Like I remember talking to a family years ago who had a child who was very fascinated with like designer clothing and expensive fashion and things like that. And they were like, how do we explain that? I think the child was at a school where there was a lot of that, and they were like, how do we explain that that's just not somewhere that we want to spend our money, And I was like, well, you talk to them about your values, and really when you get down to it, what you'll probably see is that you've already been showing them those values in ways throughout your life, but maybe you've never had that conscious conversation with them about, hey, this is one of our family's values and here's why it's important to us. And by the way, when you're an adult, if you decide that's something you value, then that's your choice, but that's part of being a kid, is sort of that you're living under your family's values, and they can be a part of the conversation, but they don't really decide what those are.
Okay. Got it. Yeah.
So is there any we're talking about involving like older kids in these conversations, would you do that at all with more like the discipline? We're kind of talking about like getting on the same page as parents. So what would be examples of situations other than the values where you might involve the child or the teenager or whatever that is in the conversation? Are there situations, or do you really still
Yeah.
just get on the same page as a couple and then bring that to the young person?
No, I think anything that's a recurring breakdown, you can bring your kids into the conversation and ask them, "Hey, what do you think is fair, or what do you think would work here?"
Mhm.
And then it's collaborative, and absolutely they can have a say in it. And again, it's about, so that goes into what Gigi was asking, I think, about implementation, right? So that's one of the processes that you can do. I think the caveat there is, if it's something where the parents have a lot of charge around the topic, the parents need to talk separately first, because if you're going to involve your kids in the conversation, you still need to be relatively aligned before you
Yeah.
go into that conversation with your kids, because you don't
Yeah.
want, goes into where it starts affecting family dynamics. What you don't want is to bring your child into the conversation and then the child and one parent agree and then end up, kind of creating this issue with the other parent. And so
Mhm.
it's important for the parents to get clarity first and then bring your kids in and say, "Hey, we've been talking about this. We know this is a common breakdown. What do you think would work here? What do you think is fair?" And then the answer that you have as parents might shift a little bit because you'll get your kids' input, but ultimately you have to figure out that piece with you and your partner first. Otherwise, you're really setting up the potential for some tricky dynamics there.
Yeah, and I just want to bring up one more thing because of my experience with families also is it's so important when you do this, the tone that you have together too, that it's not like, oh yeah, because that's the way your mother sees it or whatever, right? And because that also hugely, for the unification of the family is the couple really not just says they're on the same page, but their tone has to show that, right? The respect with each other is so, so, so important too. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm.
So at what age, like, what's the value of bringing a child into that conversation versus the parents just getting clear and bringing it to the child? That's the first question. And the second one is, at what age do you start to involve them in those conversations?
Mhm.
Because, how do you know?
Yeah. I mean, the value of it is that you get their buy-in on things, for one, right? So kids are much more likely to cooperate and be engaged in a new system or role or process if they were a part of creating it, because they don't feel like you're just controlling their lives and telling them what to do. They feel like they have some agency. And the other value is that you're teaching them a skill, right? You're teaching them how to deal with an issue or a breakdown in their lives, a positive form of communication, and really a relationship skill for their future, right? So huge value in it. And what age, I think it depends on the child and the situation a little bit, but you can start doing this as soon as children are fully verbal. So, 2 to 3 years old in some cases, and the conversation with the 2 or 3-year-old will look very different than it does with a 10 or 12-year-old. They're not going to be making as many choices, but I just did this recently with my 3-year-old. We were having huge bedtime issues, and I had a conversation with him about it outside of bedtime. And we decided together on, a number of things that he was allowed to ask for before he went to sleep at night, because he was doing the classic asking for 10 million things before he would go to bed. So now he chooses two things. So we decided
Mm.
together, you can choose two things. We made a list of what those different things could be, and every night he picks two of them, and it's great. And he is excited about it because he got to help create it. But again, with a 10 or a 12-year-old, this might look more complex. Like, you might just bring an issue to them and say, "Hey, we've been struggling with this. What do you think would work here?" And they might actually have their own ideas and solutions to bring to the table. So,
I think that's just something that most parents wouldn't necessarily think about, right?
Yeah.
And I really
Mhm.
like that component, and also the kind of caveat of making sure that you've had the conversation first as a couple, you're mostly on the same page, and then, okay, maybe there's some room for some wiggle room or getting some input from the kid. And I think there's even room, if you have that conversation with the child, to not make the decision in that moment if you guys aren't aligned or can't agree with the input from the child, to say, hey, okay, we're going to think about this and come back to you and let you know. Right.
Mhm. Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess my kind of final area I'd love to dive into, and then if Gigi has any other questions as well, but I'm curious, as someone who's about to have my first child, what would you share with new parents who like don't really know the approach they want to take with their kids yet? This is something Sunny and I are talking about a lot, is like, how do we want to raise our kids and what kind of discipline approach and all these kinds of things, but we don't really know. So how can a new parent navigate that?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I would say some of it is you learn on the job, and absolutely talking about your family values is a great start, and, those might evolve a little bit once you have kids, but talking about what's important to you, how you want to raise your kids, what values you want to instill in them can just help you give a framework. And then, yeah, I mean, if you know kind of what the structure of your parenting is going to look like and who's going to be more of the primary parent and things like that, just talking through like what would it look like if I, you could do almost like scenarios, if I thought that, it was important for our kids to, I don't know, having a hard time thinking of a good example right now, but if I thought it was important for them to go to bed at a certain time and you thought that bedtime could be more flexible, how would we handle that? Who would be who would have the final say? How would we decide? So those give you a couple of starting places, or same thing, talking about any of those areas that one of you might own more than the other. If something's really important to you, if health is really important to you, or if, even like things you want them to be involved in or things you want to teach them about are important to you, or one value that's more important to you, then that could be something that you own more in your relationship.
Yeah, something else you shared with me that I thought was a really great point was just like talking to other parents too about like what are the things that came up, or where were they on different pages, or what if they had to navigate, and sort of just asking those questions to start to prepare yourself and have those
Yeah.
conversations. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's helpful just to hear how other people work it out and those challenges that you go through in the early days. And one thing I would say to new parents too is that I think sometimes when people have babies, they think this stuff is really far off. But, my 1-year-old is already pushing the boundaries, so it starts earlier than you would think,
Talk, right?
Yeah.
I think the
Yeah.
minute they can talk
Yeah.
and walk, and then they're like, I got this.
I don't even think they have to really be able to talk. They just have to understand what you're saying.
Yeah.
As soon as you have to set a boundary with them and then they realize that, wait a minute, I have a choice in life, then it begins. So yeah. So I think just to know that stuff starts really early,
Awesome. Well, from either one of you, any final questions or thoughts or anything you want to share for parents who are looking to get on the same page here?
I would just, like with the example that McKenna gave, if you were working with a client, or a couple, and they had the situation, like you said, they had different views on how would you navigate, what would you say to them? How would you work with them with that?
Well, the first thing would just be to understand why something is really important to them, So just to kind of get to the bottom of it, because I think sometimes people don't even know why they feel so strongly about something. That's a funny one, is like you'll talk it out and then someone will just realize, oh, I guess I just thought that was important because my parents did that, or I guess I thought it was important because, I guess I do have this value I've never thought about, or, so I think just being able to identify what's behind something that has a charge to it can be really helpful, because then it can help the other parent see like, oh, okay, well, that's, if that's important to you because of that, then I can yield a little bit on it. I can relax a little bit on it. Or on the flip side, you might realize like, oh, I guess I'm just doing that because my parents did it. And then you might realize it's actually not as important to me as I thought it was, because sometimes, how that is, like sometimes you get into a disagreement about something that just builds over time, and then you're kind of just like arguing about it for the sake of arguing, and you don't even really know why it matters. So I think that would be the first thing. And then it would be kind of like, if it's something you really can't agree on, I mean, there's kind of different levels of that and levels of like how important it is, but it would be kind of deciding like who gets who gets the final say on this, you know, and looking across the board on your parenting. I mean, this is something that comes up for me in my relationship because, you know, this is kind of like my wheelhouse and I do make a lot of the decisions for our kids. And so sometimes I have to step back and say like, oh, wait, is this one that I just need to like let my husband have this one, you know, like if this is something he cares about or he just wants to do with the kids and I don't necessarily agree with it or I don't like his approach, sometimes I just have to take the back seat and be like, okay, well, I get to own a lot of things and they're his kids too, you know, and that's the bottom line. So you're not always going to agree as parents, but I think what's important there is kind of what you were saying, Gigi, about tone is like actually choosing to let something go completely and actually choosing to let the other parent own it and not holding on to resentment. And if you're feeling like there's resentment, that there's more work that has to be done there. So
that is so important for the listener to know in these kind of conversations, that asking the why, you know, that is so true. If we get to the heart of like the why of why somebody wants something, I think it makes us more empathetic towards them too, right? Because then it's not just this is what I want because I want it. And there creates an understanding and hopefully a collaboration. So I love that. The why and then the letting go and really, really finding that there are times when, you know, you do turn it over, even if it's your wheelhouse. This is so important. I see this so many times in people that are really good at something and then they take the lead all the time. And then the other thing that happens in, like you talked about earlier, Mariah, then that parent gets frustrated because they are always making the decisions. So those are great distinctions for the listener. Yeah.
Absolutely. And, you know, if somebody is listening, Mariah, and they're going, this is a lot. It's great, but it's a lot. And I'm like trying to imagine navigating all this and like following the steps and going through the values and going through the list of, you know, areas. Can they email you and ask questions or set up a call with you? I know you do work with parents, so how would they reach out to you? Is there an email address or?
Absolutely. Yeah, they can email me. It's just mariah@easefulmama.com. And yeah, you send me your questions. And usually if somebody's curious, I'll do kind of a short introductory call with them. And then I can, you know, share more about how I work with families through coaching. But I'm happy to kind of accept any questions.
So that's mariah@easefulmama.com. We'll put that in the show notes as well. Feel free to reach out to her. I know I call her all the time. All of us sisters that have kids are like, Mariah, what do we do about this? I'm sure if Gigi was still raising them, you might even be asking her questions. I don't know.
Ask if you. Yeah, Mariah, this is such wise information. I mean, in many ways, the way you convey it, it's really simple, even though, like McKenna said, it's complex in one way, but you've just given the listener like these really simple ways to start. And I think that's so important for the listener to start with baby steps, I always say, because do little bits and try, because what we shared here, these are lifelong skills for a family. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So thank
and
you
they really
so much. Yeah.
If you have a parent in your life, so if you're listening, whether you're a parent or you're not, but if you have a parent in your life that you think would really benefit from this, value this information, you know, maybe they're struggling a little bit, or you might even not even know that. You might just think, well, maybe they'll find this interesting. Please share this episode with them, because that really, really, the more we can get this information out there, the better. So thank you, Mariah, for your wisdom.
I just want to say one more thing that just popped into my head. I think it's really important for people who have older kids. If you listen to this and you think like, oh my gosh, have we been doing this for years? And did we mess something up? Absolutely not. You can always repair. And the most important thing is to go to your kids with your partner. Talk to your partner first, but go to your kids with your partner and tell them, own up to it and say, hey, we haven't always been consistent and we really want to work on this. So you're never too late to work on these dynamics and to repair and to rebuild if you feel like you have been caught in this dynamic for a long time.
And the amazing thing is, you know, I have clients all the time. It shifts immediately. It changes the whole family dynamic. So you don't, like you said, you don't have to put years in. Yeah. So
Well, thank you, Mariah, for your wisdom, and Gigi for your
Yeah,
brilliant
thank you.
questions and raising Mariah. So if you could share this wisdom.
Letting her come through me.
Yes. And we'll
All
see you
right.
all on the next episode. Thank
Yeah, thank you,
you.
ladies.
Okay, thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Bye.
That's our episode for today, but let's not make it the end of our love story. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast and think of some women in your life you'd love to share it with. And if you want to learn more about our events and programs, visit wayofthemuse.com. See you next time.